Hello, everybody. Welcome back to round two of Professor Reynolds' discussion with the Daves, I think we can call this. We are recording this second round several days after our first one, which I think folks have already checked out on YouTube. I have a bit of hay fever, so pardon me if I'm doing a lot of sneezing or blowing my nose, but that aside, the chat I want to have tonight with Dave Fialkov and Dave D'Angelo has more to do with what is going on right now with the state of the 2020 election. I mean, we hear constantly, and for good reason, that this is an election of enormous consequence. And I think thanks to the nature of the candidates, it's pretty clear that the decision facing the country is very stark. As we have discussed in class and made reference to a few times, we are seeing signs of possibility of extremely high turnouts, conceivably breaking records going back a century. And as a result of the coronavirus, we've seen this tremendous surge in early voting. The most recent numbers I saw today was something to the effect of, I want to say something like 30 million Americans have already voted, something like
40,
that.
40 million.
That's a noticeable noticeable slice of the entire population, let alone the electorate, which is always much smaller than the total population. So for I think obvious reasons, this election has generated a massive amount of engagement and interest and enthusiasm, and where that enthusiasm will fall, we will see once the election plays out. So as far as the conversation goes, I think the goal here is I would like to get a sense of what both of you think are, well, first of all, your read on the election as you see it. And again, as we've discussed in class, this isn't a matter of prediction so much. I don't think anyone wants to commit themselves to anything that's specific given the context. But from the perspective of two professionals in politics, I would be curious to sort of get your big picture read of where we are right now. And also, based on the work you do and the things that you find to be most important or care about most in politics, what do you think it's important for people to be paying attention to? Just because in this election, this is true, I think, in most elections, but it's especially true now. It can be almost impossible to focus on one particular element in the sort of swirl of chaos. So I would like to get a sense from both of you of what you think people should be looking out for, what they should be paying attention to. And D'Angelo, so I'd like to start with you and ask, so from your perspective, working on the ground with a lot of these state legislative races in Texas, obviously a major outcome or a major factor in thinking about the outcome of these elections is that we are in a census year, which means since we are counting the population of the whole country per the Constitution this year, in the next couple of years, new House district maps will be drawn to reflect the changes in population that have occurred in the new census, which means it's going to be mostly the majority party in state legislatures drawing these district lines. And that always, of course, brings up the question of gerrymandering, partisan advantage in drawing these lines. So from the perspective of Texas, which I know has a big slate of legislative races this year, what do you see as being a potential outcome of this as far as redistricting goes?
Sure. So nationally, there are going to be multiple legislative chambers that if they flip, it could have an impact on the lines that are drawn in 2021 for 2022 to 2032. That is going to be a little fewer than the Republicans had in 2010, only because Democrats had captured in 18 more chambers. Republicans have firmed up their grip on some of the Republican-leaning states that had old existing Southern Democrats in them who were wiped out or became Republicans themselves. And so the nature of the coalitions remain the same, just the names of the parties. Texas right now is probably the biggest prize of them all. As I discussed in our last recording, if the Texas State House goes Democrat, which means they pick up 9 seats, that means that at worst, the Democrats can deadlock the process. So it defaults to a panel that will draw what's considered fair maps that take into account population centers around cities, counties, demographic groups, which could lead to congressional Democrats gaining several to half a dozen seats in a close election for control of the House in 2022. That could be the difference between who has a majority. I mean, it also matters because the census lines dictate funding. One issue that we have down here that's not necessarily tied to the election is uh, because the federal government has curtailed the amount of time that people can fill out the census. Those in certain areas of Texas where they have low response rates, that means that we're leaving money on the table. That, when federal appropriations occur, or even congressional reapportionment, we could be leaving a seat on the table. So, it is a significant, issue that it's going to be coming up that goes beyond, who wins this election, but the real world consequences for individuals and families for the next decade.
Get a little more into a bit of the technical details. So you mentioned earlier this possibility that depending on what sort of majority comes out of the elections, it would be possible if Democrats, if not necessarily controlling the process, could deadlock the process in the legislature, at which point it would be tossed to a panel. And
Yep.
I just want to say one thing that folks might not be aware of is that you might know that state legislatures are typically the bodies in charge of doing this redistricting, but it's increasingly the case that there's a judicial element as well. So could you say a little bit more about these panels to which the process is sometimes thrown?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in Texas as to the makeup of the panel, so you'll forgive me if I can't go into the technicals, but you are correct that because it differs state by state, whether it's a commission or a legislative draw, it will look different and they will come to different conclusions. What we've seen most recently in Texas, based on racial gerrymandering, in North Carolina on racial gerrymandering, and in Pennsylvania, non-racial gerrymandering, is that courts have stepped in and mandated different lines be drawn. And what we've seen in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and in 2016, Florida and Virginia, is when they've done that and they've usually consolidated populations, it has benefited Democrats because Democrats tend to do better in urban suburban areas. So if you have a district that is wholly centered around an urban suburban area, that is now going to favor a Democrat.
And coming back to what you were saying about the possible makeup of like a Texas delegation in the future, in a maximal scenario where Democrats are able to draw more robust districts for themselves, would that in part be a consequence of the fact that the Democrats are seeing favorable demographic growth in parts of Texas where that has typically not been the case? Or in other words, are Democrats developing strength in Texas in parts of the state where they had typically been weak?
Yes, no, it's the latter. So what you're seeing is part of the strength is you start with, say, an urban core in Austin or Houston or Dallas, and as individuals move further from the city center, mostly because of housing costs, that is effectively turning these outlying areas of a county or seeping into other counties bluer. So a good example, Austin is the capital of Texas. It's also the main city in Travis County. A lot of individuals who work in Austin are now moving into, the Southern County Hayes, the Northern County Williamson. Those two areas, which are seeing explosive growth over 10 to 20 years, have become more democratic. And, the population change is then affecting these boundaries that are set, whether arbitrarily every 10 years or just within a county, because in Texas, there is local government. So what you're seeing are, hitherto Republican county legislatures, or what we call county commissions, being flipped by Democrats. And those are not impacted by who wins the state house or, who controls Congress.
I see. And that's a really important point, I think, to bring up, that you can have this primarily economic trigger, like housing costs, childcare costs, what have you, that in tandem with other factors can set off this tectonic shift, in politics that it might take 10 years, 20 years to really reverberate. But, yeah, I think we're unused to thinking about deeper causes like that. I think that's a really important point to bring up. And one last thing I wanted to ask, sort of related to that, was, pardon me, um, oh shoot, we might have to edit around this. I completely lost my train of thought. I'll have to edit this point out at somewhere. Yeah, the
You're
outcome.
the editor. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, right. I can
You're
do
in
this.
charge.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to come back to the economy thing before I lost it, but then I forgot
Yeah,
what else I wanted to ask.
if it comes to you, that's what editing's for. Look, I'm feeling punchy too. It's we're all tired. It's been long days for all three of us.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, and again, I'm not going to get into the game of predictions, but like, would you rather be right now, a Texas Democrat or a Texas Republican staring down election day?
It depends what district I'm in.
Fair enough.
No, look, Texas Democrats are on the upswing. No matter the results on November 3rd, they're going to be on the upswing in 2022. What you're seeing are a significant increase in competitive races, the congressional, at the state and the local level. Now, part of that is an artifice of these demographic changes we're seeing, but it's also an artifice of Donald Trump and this massive enthusiasm, whether positive for Biden or negative against Trump, that is driving them. What is not to predict this, but I don't think people appreciate that in 2 or 4 years, some of the tide could swing back if some of these voters feel that the party locally or in DC has moved too far to the left. Like, what we see in the national discourse is everyone's talking about the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and there is a significant segment of the party that believes in that fervently. But there are a lot of voters in Texas who they're not about that. They like Joe Biden not because of what he represents relative to Donald Trump, but because they like the idea of, okay, my taxes aren't going to skyrocket. I'd like to see more education funding. Yes, the Affordable Care Act is good, but I don't want to lose my private insurance or my car. So, right or wrong, those are people who, if the Republicans modulated their message, could come back. They're not like, hardcore leftist Brooklyn Democrats, no offense. So it's like, I think that we need to be mindful of it and not just assume that these are people who are definitely locked in for a generation.
No, and I think that's a really important point, especially because that Trump effect, a Republican who who could just keep it together a bit better and not be embarrassing in the way Trump has been, would probably have a much easier time winning back a lot of these voters, even if from a policy perspective, things didn't change all that much, right? In other words, I do think a lot of it has to do with that affect that's benefiting the Democrats now in a way that wasn't maybe the case in 2016.
Right, and a good example is John Cornyn, the senior senator from Texas, who's up for re-election. He is polling in the high 40s, low 50s, depending on what you look at. He's got a slight to mid single digit lead over his opponent, MJ Hagar. And I believe he will likely outperform Donald Trump, in part because even though he has an incredibly conservative record, he is not identified as a Trump-like Republican. Ted Cruz was not thought of very well by a segment of the population. John Cornyn does not have those negative attributes. So John Cornyn will have those policy perspectives of a Trump administration with some tweaks, but not be tarred with the same negative image, the same, gross or, backroom behavior that some people are turned off by. And MJ Hagar is she's better than, say, a generic Democrat, but she represents, that rising Democratic tide where you get a certain segment that is attracted to more Democrats, that has been activated by 2016 and is likely to remain in the party. It's not enough to always guarantee a majority, but it takes maybe Democrats from being stuck at 40% every election to 45%, which, depending on the environment and a multitude of other factors, is a big difference.
Yeah, and that'll be the outcome of that will be interesting too, especially measuring like, is there any sort of what could Democrats say about looking at, say, like Beto's race in 2018 and whatever happens with Hagar, in this race, what that says about the possible trajectory of the party in Texas or something like
Yep.
that. Yeah, it'll be another data point to get down. So yeah, and to switch directions slightly, although I think this, this sort of hangs over everything. Uh, one very important aspect of this year's election that has not been so much at the forefront of people's minds in recent election cycles has been the question of what happens in a context where the president has repeatedly made claims that the process is rigged and the process is rigged against him, but he makes these claims in such a way as to make it clear that it's only rigged to the extent that he is defeated. In other words, the president's deliberately casting mistrust and uncertainty on the outcome of the election. I think the theory being that if the election is close enough in certain key states, it would become a matter for court intervention, and we could see a possible repetition of the Bush v. Gore fiasco of 2000 that could conceivably hand the presidency back to Trump, even if he is, again, soundly defeated in the popular vote and only wins the electoral vote with a somewhat questionable intervention from the judiciary. So this level of uncertainty and projecting possible scenarios about this, while not unprecedented in American history, is rare. And it's definitely something that is, I think, worth paying attention to very much. So Dave Fialkov, just to throw this to you at the moment as far as election law goes, what do you think are the most important scenarios to think about when it comes to a possible and I got to keep using this phrase, a judicial intervention in deciding the outcome of the election in November? What are some of the possibilities there?
So the first thing that it's important to keep in mind is that elections in America are very decentralized, right? The federal government doesn't have a lot to do with how elections are governed. At the end of the day, every state has authority to determine when their polls are open, where their polls are going to be located, how they're going to treat absentee ballots. Are you going to count all of them, even if they come in a day or two after election day, if they were postmarked ahead of time? All of these decisions are different in different states. And what that basically means is that the legal underpinning of the election is really kind of diluted. In other words, there are creative kind of tactics that you can employ to try and manipulate the outcome of the election in terms, if you think that most absentee voters are going to vote for the other guy, or you think that most mail-in voters are going to vote for the other guy, it is in your interest to try and push courts to interpret the law of that state in a way that minimizes the degree that mail-in ballots are going to be counted. And people who don't agree with that, right, would call that kind of fraudulent, right? You're trying to suppress the vote. This country has a very long and distinguished history of voter suppression that actually relates back in a lot of ways to gerrymandering, which we should circle back to. But regardless, but the flip side of that, of course, is that, there have been a lot of concern over voter fraud. This concept of voters either voting twice or getting other people who wouldn't otherwise vote for a particular candidate to vote for that candidate, and kind of bundling all of those different ballots together and fraudulently getting people to vote in one direction. Those are things that there's not a lot of evidence for, right? I mean, I think that there have been less than 200 voter fraud cases brought in this country in the last 20 or 30 years or so. All of them have involved something like 100 or 200 votes, right? So even if all of those people who were accused of it were guilty, there has been no scheme to really indicate that there's a broad enough enterprise at work that it could shift the outcome of the election. But given how polarized we've become as a country over the last 20 years, elections are generally a little bit closer than they have been, right? Both for House and Senate and president. And the closer an election is, the more incentive you have to try and manipulate these kind of legal underpinnings of elections in different states, because if, you know, just to use simple numbers, if the election is going to be within 500 votes, and you think that by getting a favorable ruling on how you count absentee ballots, you can gain 800 votes, then it's really worth pursuing that. If you know you're going to lose by 10,000 votes, then who cares, right? So the closer elections become, the more vulnerable kind of ambiguities and uncertainties become in these various states. And that's even more so during a pandemic when you know, the laws for mail-in voting were not written anticipating that such a large percentage of people would be voting.
You know,
So that's kind of the background I would go into this with.
yeah, and let me just to stop you right there for a second. I think again that's a hugely important point. Is that one effect of polarization has been to make your average political race significantly closer, and at the presidential level, even it's such a marked contrast to the 20th century, or to, you know, to many episodes of the 20th century. Even if it's not really in living memory for us, it's in the living memory of people who sort of shaped the system as we know it. And what I'm getting at is just this notion, whether it's, you know, it's FDR or Lyndon Johnson or Nixon or Reagan, blowout elections in which a winning candidate swept, you know, 40, 49 states in some cases, were not uncommon. I mean, roughly, I think you could call it almost a once in a decade phenomenon, I think, for at least the second half of the 20th century. And that has changed dramatically, such that Barack Obama's victory in 2008, where it was like 53% of the popular vote, something like that.
Yeah.
What, and how many, does anyone
Close
remember?
to- He won by close to 10 million votes. He had 365 electoral votes. It was the single largest presidential victory since 1988 when George Bush defeated Mike Dukakis.
Right. And yeah, so just to underscore this point that Obama's victory in 2008 was certainly the most decisive of our conscious lifetimes. And yet, not only was that not met, you know, it was met by resistance that you would normally see from a much closer election. I think that has to do obviously with the incentives of the party and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I just want to underscore this point that we are, yeah, thanks to issues larger than just the outcome of a given election, we are used to much closer races than has been the case in recent American history.
And I'll just add that election led to 60 Democratic U.S. senators once Arlen Specter flipped in 2009. Again, inconceivable now that one of the two parties, because of an even higher degree of polarization, could get close to 60 seats in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, and that's such a fascinating dynamic because the polarization is a tad asymmetrical right now in the Trump era, just because he's never had majority support. He's had the loyalty of the party and sort of carryover effects by virtue of being the head of the Republican Party. But in terms of his core support, it's always been a minority. And yet he and the Republicans have certainly not governed in that way, right? They've governed as if they've been delivered, you know, this very large mandate, as if it was like a Reagan 84 or Bush 88 kind of win.
That seems to me in recent history to be the modus operandi of Republicans when they obtain power. I'd say the exception being 2009-10, when Democrats controlled all three branches and there was an urgency to doing something and utilizing those majorities. But look, like you said, Republicans in 2017, Republicans in 2001, you know, the Reagan era, you know, when they have any amount of power, they have no inhibitions to utilizing it.
Yep, they exercise it.
Yeah.
And speaking of, I think, you know, Fialkov, this might be a good point to talk about, you know, the shadow that looms over possible challenges to election results and court intervention in the coming weeks is the experience of the 2000 election and the battle over the Florida vote and ultimately the Supreme Court's intervention in Bush versus Gore. And I mean, you could write several very fine books on the topic, but in the absence of giving us something that detailed, could you just give us sort of just a brief overview of what the key outcome of that 2000 election was and how that has affected the way we maybe think about election law since then?
Sure. So the nature of the dispute in Florida, I don't know if people have heard of the term hanging chads or not. But
I'd be willing to bet no one younger than us is familiar with that phrase.
So the very long story short is on election night, it became clear that Florida was going to be very, very close. And whoever won Florida was going to win the election. So it was kind of the perfect storm that we were talking about before for kind of legal battles. And the more people dug into what was going on in Florida, they figured out, like I said before, they're very decentralized. Different counties come up with their own ballots, right? And a lot of that is because we vote on so many things in this country that if you live in one neighborhood or another neighborhood, you're going to vote, you're going to have different people on your ballot. So anyway, the more we dug into what was going on in Florida, it was clear that a lot of the ballots were very confusing. And a lot of them had kind of outdated mechanisms for casting your vote, whether filling in a bubble or kind of poking a hole through a piece of paper, that it became unclear sometimes to ascertain whether somebody actually intended to vote for a candidate or didn't intend to vote for a candidate. And obviously, in an environment where the entire election hinges on one state and it's down to within 1,000 votes in a particular state, every ballot is going to get scrutinized closely. And George W. Bush at the time had a lead, a relatively big, tiny lead in the grand scheme of things, but a sizable enough lead so that he wanted to basically stop the counting. Whereas Al Gore was saying that a lot of the ballots that should have been counted were not because of a mistake. We should go through, preserve the right to vote, and count every ballot. The case got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, relying on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Am I going too deep, Callie?
No, this because I think it's good to get into the thinking of the courts on this.
Right. Okay. So edit around that.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Keep going.
All right. So the case got to the Supreme Court, and then relying on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which was written after the Civil War, right, where they're trying to integrate slaves into the general population. They want to give them equal protection under law as white people. They relied on the Equal Protection Clause to basically say, look, people in Miami could be counting a little bit of a dot in a bubble as a vote. People in Tallahassee may look at a dot in a bubble and not count it as a vote. So therefore, if you're going to recount all of the votes, you're denying different voters equal protection, because the same exact vote in one county could be treated differently than the same exact vote in another county. So that is an astonishingly original interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, right? And ironically enough, it was the 5 conservative justices who voted on it and interpreted it that way, had historically not kind of broadly interpreted the Equal Protection Clause in creative ways, right? They were not on the cutting edge of equal protection jurisprudence. So the fact that they found that kind of, they bent over backward, I would say, to reach that conclusion showed 2 things. One, that judges are clearly willing to kind of it pierced the veil of nonpartisanship in the eyes of candidates, right? Because they now see, if we get a favorable judge, they may try and tilt the scale for us, just like they did in Bush v. Gore. The other thing is that, think about the concept of there being a new rule that you have to count every vote equally and treat different voters equally in a system, like I said, that is so decentralized, right? So when you have a case like that on the books, you have tighter elections, and you have such a decentralized system, inevitably now everybody's filing cases, right? It was a crazy thing about 2000 also is that after both sides realized they had to be going to court, they basically had to scramble and hire lawyers. They didn't have anybody on staff preparing for this. Now Joe Biden and Donald Trump each, I think Biden has like 20 lawyers working full time, anticipating what this fight would look like if it happened in Wisconsin, what it would look like if it happened in Pennsylvania, all of this stuff, right? So it fundamentally in 2000, over the last 20 years, has shifted what we consider to be a, quote, normal role for the judicial system to play in kind of the transfer of power.
Thank you. That is one of the finer, concise recountings of that scenario, man. And having lived through it, it was much messier at the time. But yeah. And of course, this resonates not just with the larger context of a possibly challenged election, but the fact that we're going through the middle of a highly rushed Supreme Court nomination hearing.
Absolutely.
Replacement for Justice Ginsburg on the court, who we now know in the context of Bush v. Gore should be thought of as a possible vote, or as a possible partisan vote, right? As the decisive vote for the conservative wing of the court.
The other thing worth mentioning too, that I don't know if you think that everyone knows this and edit around it, but a lot more Democrats are expected to vote by mail, and a lot more Republicans are expected to vote in person, right? So when there's such a clear demarcation, it means that the lines of what side you should be on in a particular battle are clearer. So Democrats are far more comfortable defending the mail-in vote no matter where they are, right? Whereas if it were a little bit more balanced, there'd be no real, like if half of the people voting by mail were Republican, half were voting by Democrat, there would be no need or incentive for either party to try and suppress that vote, because they figure they may get some of it just like the other guy may, right? So that's the key factor. And another implication of that is that a lot of states don't count mail-in votes until election day. So if you're getting these millions upon millions of ballots coming into the precinct, you're not allowed to count them until election day. Whereas on election day, you can count what people are, the vote kind of on a rolling basis. That means that on election night, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whenever the polls close, most states are going to have a pretty complete count of who voted on election day, but they will not have a full complete count of people who voted before election day, right? So what that means as a practical matter is it is going to be a deceptively Republican vote total compared to what the final count would be, right? And when you have that possibility, that narrative, right? Imagine and there's going to be, I hope there are a lot of discussions happening at media networks about how to handle this situation. But the 30%, 40% of the vote in, are they going to show the map red, right? Because the entire country could look red, right? Parts of the country that we wouldn't even think would be ever considered to be voting red could look red on election night, which can create a media narrative that may cast some of these kind of shifts from red to blue as mail-in votes are counted, cast a little kind of suspicion on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a hugely important point to bring up because we, in the era of modern mass media, and especially since the rise of cable news, we've grown used to this notion that elections are called on election night, when in fact what's happening in the vast majority of those cases is that media organizations who have hired a bunch of data nerds for the purposes of these elections are making projections based on raw data as it comes in. And what almost always ends up happening is that the statisticians processing this information as it comes in make projections that the network then advertises, right? They are, CNN is calling, Pennsylvania for Trump, right? Or something along those lines. Vast majority of cases, the final vote total is in line with the projection on election night, right? Maybe not exactly, but generally not enough to change the winner. If we are used to that, we are used to a completely arbitrary cutoff point for when an election is over, because in the legal sense that matters, an election is only completed once its results have been certified and verified by the requisite authority, whether it's the Secretary of State of a given state, or when it comes to the electoral vote for the president, Congress has to finalize it in December. So there's nothing wrong with networks not calling things on election night, because if they don't have the data to make an accurate projection, they have to wait till the data comes in, until the election is actually concluded. And as Dave, you point out, because we have this massive asymmetry this year where you have so many people voting absentee, and you have many states in which they are legally not allowed to start counting those until election day, yes, it could look very different on election night, but all you're seeing is a snapshot of a moment in time, right? Nothing
Well,
is complete. And from the perspective of, from the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, I should say, we know that because they've as much as said this, part of their strategy relies on furthering the impression that the results announced through the media on the night of the election are somehow definitive. And any changes to that, say a change that ultimately brings Joe Biden ahead in places like, Nevada, right? Nevada could very well look red on election night, even though no one paying attention, as far as I'm aware, thinks there's a serious chance that Biden isn't going to win Nevada, right?
well, let me, Nick.
Oh yes, please.
Let me just say several things about that. In principle, that's correct. I know Pennsylvania is likely to be the Florida of 2020. There, the scenario that Fialkov outlined is most applicable to their state laws and their inexperience with mail voting, where you can see all of that crash together. One thing as relates to Trump that I will point out, because North Carolina, Florida, Virginia do have experience with early voting, mail voting, and counting early, what you might actually see is the media refusing to make any calls throughout the night, irrespective of who's winning, but Joe Biden jumping out to a large early lead in those states. Now, maybe that does not decide the election, but what you may possibly see is the inability of, say, President Trump to declare himself the winner, because he, on election night at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, does not have a lead in those states. Now, maybe Biden does win and the margin closes, but those, or in Texas, you are going to see an early burst, because while Democrats are voting in high numbers by mail, they're also voting early. So again, coming back to Texas, mail voting is restricted to only certain populations, most of whom are over 65. So all of this phenomenal early vote we're seeing is in person. And how it has worked traditionally, and what we saw in 2018, is when 7 o'clock hits and polls close, the early vote comes in immediately. And you will see from these large Democrat-leaning counties a massive surge for Joe Biden. And again, even if he loses Texas, he is going to appear to have a lead. So around the time that Florida and North Carolina are reporting, you're going to see bursts for Joe Biden. Now, I do not believe that Donald Trump is going to declare victory because he has more votes in the popular national margin, which he has been discrediting since he won in 2016. So it would come down to, I won Florida, I won North Carolina, the election's over. Will it be? Maybe not. So not to say what you and Dave have been discussing won't happen, but I'm a little more optimistic that we can avert that sort of result, if the early voting appears what the polls show, heavily in favor of the Democrats.
Yeah, well, and look, I'm glad you brought that up, because for one thing, I didn't know that. That's just interesting in and of itself, but also it underscores that this year more so than others, the perils of even predicting broad outcomes or likelihoods are messier than in normal years. The number of variables that could end up having an outsized effect on the election, I think, are uniquely large this year. And it's just, it makes a mockery of almost trying to make sense of it, even in the context of recent elections. There's just so many intervening factors. But that's really interesting. I hadn't considered that. Pardon me, guys. Hay fever. I'm like an old man over here. I think
around the nose blowing.
You keep saying this like I'm Steven Spielberg, man. Like edit around this. It's entirely possible this conversation right now is going to be seen by the students.
I hope for your sake that you don't have to show them you blowing your nose. But it's fine. Everybody's human.
Blowing my nose, they can live through that. I think this did an excellent job of getting, I think, some really crucial aspects of the election on the table. Is there, I don't want to say anything so trite as a parting thought, but is there anything else you think people sort of need to know, or things people should be keeping themselves aware of or keeping in mind as we, I think as of the night we're recording this, we're 13 days away from election day. What should they be thinking about?
Patience patience with the counting. There are going to be people on Twitter, very intelligent data analysts, who are going to project early, but even they can be wrong. It's been proven in the past with primaries, in part because the turnout will be higher no matter who wins, and that throws anyone's models out the window. But I would leave some parting thoughts, is that demographics and districts are destiny. Money does matter. Yard sides don't, and everyone should vote.
I like that. Yalkov, your thoughts?
My final thought, I mean, I think that the whole election is really going to be a referendum on polling, right? To what degree are we actually able to capture the mood of the country the way we could at one point, right? Because, if we can still do that, then Biden will win by a lot, and it'll be pretty clear early that he'll win. But if we haven't quite figured out a way, if kind of the disruptions that social media has injected into how we kind of get our information, if that has so fundamentally altered the ability of pollsters to capture different segments of the population, then that means that there will not, like, because if Trump wins, not only would there be the backlash you would just expect from kind of watching culture evolve over the last 6 months, but it also will mean that pollsters have absolutely no idea what they're doing, even more so in 2016, right? Pollsters at this point, ahead of the Clinton campaign, people inside the Trump administration were looking around saying, hey, I really think we can win this thing. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill who do their own internal polling were saying, hey, I think Trump could actually win this thing. Nobody is saying that now, right? So in a lot of ways, it could not only alter the degree to which we trust our ability to capture the mood of the country, but it also will probably expose, potentially, assuming that Biden does win in a landslide, it would expose kind of Trump's inability to build a real long-standing coalition, right? Because in 2016, the whole thinking was there's this big pocket of people that you can't capture with your polling, therefore all of your polling is off. But in fact, the polling kind of did, there was a lot of outstanding unknown things back then that there just are not now. So a lot of interesting dynamics at play there.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can say this about every election, but we are on the verge of something, I think, epochal in American history, and I think however it plays out, it's going to have some serious long-term reverberations. And I hope we can pick up on these threads when we discuss this all together next. So
if Trump wins, it will discredit polling, even if the polling for everything else has been accurate.
Yeah.
Even if it is big, it will not even matter. If Trump does win, it'll discredit that whole industry. No one will trust it again. Even if, say, they call everything else right, it will just obliterate their legitimacy.
So spare a thought for the pollsters worrying about their futures on election day. They have a lot on the line too. So
only the good ones, because there's a lot of bad ones.
That's true.
On both sides. Look, Democrats and Republican pollsters who do bad polling, just
well, and hey, and freebie spoiler for the discussion. We should absolutely have a chat when we get together with the classes to go over, who you think of as the most reliable pollsters and that sort of thing. That'll be premium content, not accessible on YouTube, right, for the folks who are registered for the class. So I will see you two and all of our other colleagues at Brooklyn College when we meet up next. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a great evening.
All right, guys. Speak later.